Well, thank you so much for such a warm welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, even though, yes, I have come from 40 degrees 2 days before I left to a little colder here. And my body still wants to sleep at very odd times. However, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and particularly honoured to be invited to do this inaugural lecture honouring David Stow. I think it's particularly insightful, I guess, amongst a whole heap of other things, of the University of Strathclyde doing this to honour David Stow. You're probably thinking, well, you know, what's the connection between an Australian and honouring David Stow? And I have to confess, I had the same question in my own head. But I think as I read a little about David Stow and understood his passion for education for all, around issues of equity, alleviation of poverty, the power of education to do those sorts of things, the importance of teachers, particularly thinking about teachers as professionals with a particular knowledge base and so on, and also, linked to my passion, the importance of effective teacher education. And so I share those passions that certainly David Stow had. And then we also have the colonial connection, because as far as I can determine, at least one of the teachers trained in David Stow's approach went to what was called then Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania. So there's another connection. But I hope that by the end of my talk, I hope we'll understand that the connections are all around, and the important thing is that we all work together to think about how to address the global agenda and how to work together. Not so much the sort of learn from each other, even though that's probably part of it. I have a little bit of a problem with that because it gets translated into policy borrowing and policy travelling with the assumption that something that's appropriate here is equally appropriate here, and I don't mean that to be so at all. But I do think that it's important for us to work together, particularly in these globalised neoliberal times that I'm going to talk about. So let me just give you a bit of an overview of where I'm going to travel tonight. Unfortunately, the current policy moment in many countries across the world is positioning teacher education as a problem. The mantra of it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. You go to many, many countries and policies is looking at how to fix teacher education. And so what I want to look at is, well, how do we get here? Because that wasn't always so. There were times when teacher education was really thought about as a focus on learning and understanding how teachers learn, and that was the main focus of how we thought about teacher education. Prior to that, there was the training agenda and so on. But I want to explore a little bit about how we got here. Then I want to spend a little bit of time showing some examples of responses, policy responses in different countries. And there's remarkable similarity in many, many countries around that. Then I'd like to share with you what I've tried to do as a teacher education researcher in speaking back to this agenda. You know, the mantra, teacher education is broken and needs to be fixed. And then finishing up by talking about some possibilities for teacher education practice, teacher education research, ways in which we might work together, and come back to David Stow a little bit at the end. As I go through this, I won't pretend to know all about the education system and teacher education in Scotland or the policy context, but I will refer to it throughout as I understand it. So forgive me if it's not exactly accurate, and you can question me or correct me towards the end. Okay, so the first one, how did we get here? Well, Pisa. Every good presentation starts with Pisa, right? This notion of global economic competitiveness, countries looking at the international rankings, ways in which they can compare themselves, and Pisa is an obvious one, and linking that to the country's economic competitiveness. We're not doing as well as X, or we're not doing as well as Y. Therefore, our schooling system is not preparing people correctly. Therefore, there must be something wrong with the teachers. And yes, you guessed it. Therefore, there must be something we need to do with teacher education. That kind of argument is being used in lots of places. Let me give you a couple of examples. The left-hand side, from the state where I currently live in New South Wales, policy documents are using these sorts of justifications. So a discussion paper that was out a couple of years ago that ended up in a policy document called Great Teaching Inspired Learning used this mantra about other countries overtaking us. The OECD results around Pisa and so on are showing that we're not doing as well as other countries. Therefore, and that's being used as the justification for all of these new policies. And of course, the Schools White Paper here in the UK also used the same sort of argument. I won't read them through, you can read them, although I know it's a little difficult in the front row. Hopefully you don't end up with a sore neck. And I noticed that there's some evidence of attention to Pisa also here in Scotland. So I came across a number of media reports from a few years ago, for example, where it's talking about falling behind other countries, comparing Scotland with the rest of the UK. So Bob Lingard talks about this a bit, that not only is Pisa being used by countries and nation states to compare with other nation states, but they're actually using it at a sub-national level to support the arguments for the sorts of things that they want to do at lower component levels, I suppose, not lower levels. And I noticed that one of the most recent reviews that was commissioned by the Scottish Government just last year also identified as one of its purposes, if you look at the second dot point there, making sure that this review, as it set out, this was its brief, to look at insights from Pisa and other evidence from different countries and so on. So this sort of notion of international rankings, comparing countries has been maybe the last at least 5 years or so, quite a juggernaut, I think, in informing policy. We've then got multinational management consulting firms. Probably the most obvious example of that is McKinsey and Company, right? And their particularly influential report, How the World's Most Improved School Systems Keep Getting Better. They, as you can see from this diagram, more than 100 offices throughout the world. You'll also notice over here, one global firm. So this notion of that there's one answer, one way we can learn from everyone, we can understand this. It's, the so-called best practice models, and they can be used everywhere. These sorts of companies have had and continue to have huge influence on policies in a range of countries throughout the world. Similarly, publishing companies, Pearson would be an example of that. And it's perhaps not an accident that one of the authors of this, Michael Barber, who is also an advisor at Pisa, of course was Tony Blair's advisor, and so there are lots of connections. Again, Pearson presents itself as, you know, this global company with, what are they talking about there? 40,000 employees, 70 countries, and of course having a huge impact on what's happening in schools, also increasingly what's happening in teacher education. And I'll talk a little bit about the teacher performance assessment in the United States that Pearson is now controlling and taking over. And then there are a range of what I would call advocacy groups. Here's an example from the US. The National Council on Teacher Quality presents itself as almost a quasi sort of government group. They have set out over the last number of years to review teacher preparation in the United States. They have identified standards, their own standards, no one else's, their own, about what they think should be in a good teacher education program. And then they have done a document review of the different programs and come up with very official and officious looking documents that rank institutions in the US. So this is just from their website. And what you can do is if you're on the website, you can hover over states. It tells you exactly which are the top teacher education providers according to their criteria, and so on and so forth. And you can see the ranks there. Now, despite an analysis that was done a couple of years ago by, I think it's Professor Fuller anyhow, from University of Pennsylvania, and really analysed all of this and debunked the method, the approach, incorrect, they left out research, incorrect application of findings, poor methodology, etc., etc., etc. Despite all of that, the NCTQ, National Council on Teacher Quality, has had a huge impact on policy and, not surprisingly, student numbers in teacher education programs across the states. People are looking at this and saying, oh, well, this program is obviously the best in this sort of ranking, therefore I want to get into that program. So they're having a huge impact on that, what's happening. And of course, governments have actually, I think, built this crescendo towards teacher education is broken and needs to be fixed. Probably started with the No Child Left Behind legislation, but some excerpts from the various Secretary of Education's report at various times, you know, this notion that colleges and schools of education simply get in the way of good people becoming teachers. And even the notion of highly qualified was redefined. So highly qualified then meant someone who had a mathematics degree or a science degree. So the sort of naming and the definitions were changed. So this issue of content knowledge and verbal ability as being the two key components of quality teaching really started to gather force in about 2003. Even as you can see there, the most recent, a recent, Anne Duncan talking about schools of education doing a mediocre job. And of course here and close by in England, the very often quoted, you know, if Michael Gove was going for promotion with citation indices, I think he'd do fairly well with this quote, actually, about teaching is a craft best learned. We know it off by heart, right? So this notion of a return to observation and practice as being the important thing, learning on the job. Another thing that has, I think, built this, notion of teacher education is in trouble. Well, it's the education academics, and I find this excerpt from a speech I think he gave somewhere quite amazing. That the problem is that the education debate has been dominated by education academics. Well, isn't that our job? Which is why much of the research and evidence and so on and so forth. And then he finishes by saying, of course, what we need to do is to put all this back in the hands of teachers and schools. Even in the States, that's gone a little bit further, where people like Art Levine, who was the president, I think, of Teachers College Columbia, wrote a book and basically said it was the called teacher education as the Wild West. Everyone did their own thing, all of these sorts of things. In Australia, recently, over the last 18 months or so, we've had a review, about the 104th review, I think, in teacher education. This was our Minister for Education when he launched this review. Teacher education's not up to scratch, courses are too theoretical, ideological, faddish, standards too low, must be too low because everyone gets through. So all of this, I can see, is building this crisis discourse that ends up with this sort of notion of teacher education is broken and needs to be fixed. And as John Furlong has said on a number of occasions, and some of his colleagues, Jeff Whitty and so on, that what's happened in this context where this crisis discourse is being taken over, that people have, governments particularly, have imagined that the only response are these kinds of neoliberal policy responses that focus on the things that I have listed there: deregulation, privatisation, competition, choice, etc., etc. Right? So let's have a look at what some of the countries that I'll just pick a few snapshots, mostly focusing on the US, Australia, and the UK. I think that's the only examples I've got. Anyway, let me see. These are some of the things that are happening across the globe. And of course, I mentioned earlier this notion of policy borrowing, travelling policy, policy cloning is getting really, really, I think, more in evidence than we've had in the past. Just to share with you 5 things that I see happening in these neoliberal responses to this crisis discourse. The first is programs that eliminate or reduce the role of universities in teacher education or higher education institutions. The second one, this focus on best practice, what works, the practical turn. The third one, this increasingly complex apparatus of certification, regulations, standards, and so on. The fourth, focusing on entry into teacher education. This is something that has really been quite strong in Australia and quite obvious in the last little while. This notion that if you've got really good people, however that might be measured rather, high school grades or whatever, if those people come into teacher education, then of course the teaching profession will be much higher quality, with the assumption that absolutely nothing happens in between, or there's, and we know there's no connection, there's no research that shows that connection. And this notion of teacher testing, and then focusing on the outputs, this notion of value add. So let me just spend a few moments on each of those. Alternative routes into teaching. Excuse me. The approaches that eliminate or reduce the role of universities. Probably the first one that came to my attention about 2003, I think, was this organisation called the American Board for the Certification of Teacher Excellence. It was set up by the Bush government in the US shortly after the No Child Left Behind legislation was rolled out. And basically, it was a website that if you had a degree, any degree, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science, whatever, and you had, I think it was about $400 at that time, you go on, pay your money, take the test, get a passport to teaching, and there were states throughout the US, only a few at the beginning, but growing, that would recognise that as a qualification for teaching. Now, I had to share this with you. I had sort of not kept up with ABCTE and where they were up to, so when I was preparing this talk, just before Christmas, I went onto their website to see what they were up to. And yes, you guessed it, it was their holiday sale. So if you went on, yeah, I had a chuckle too. If you went on over the holiday season, you got a reduced rate to take their test. Anyway, all jokes aside, it's pretty scary because there are a number of states, growing number unfortunately, of states in the US who recognise that as a qualification for teaching. To be fair, it has changed a little over the last 10 years. There is some now online study materials that you can do. Originally, it was just a test. You took the test, you were okay. You know, you can imagine what the test was. You're in a classroom and this is happening. What would you do? A, B, C, D, you know, choose the correct answer. At least now there is a little bit of information there. Anyway, I won't spend a lot of time on it, doesn't deserve it. And then, of course, Teach for America, which has become, in and of itself, a huge juggernaut. The idea that a compressed summer program, usually about 6 to 8 weeks, and then learn on the job. Of course, you know, it has all of the sorts of framings and bylines about, you know, it's almost like a Peace Corps mentality, I suppose. You go, there is something you do while you're deciding what you're going to do as a real career. And of course, it's in high needs, disadvantaged schools. And I would argue that, you know, quite privileged schools would never let teachers turn over quite as quickly as the Teach for America people do in the so-called disadvantaged schools. But it's huge, absolutely huge in the US and huge throughout the world. So I think there are now 52 Teach Fors, a franchise throughout the world. And of course, Teach First in England. And yes, we have Teach for Australia too. But I just want to point out a couple of things about this Teach for All network. You notice the terminology that's being used. A global problem. And so this is the sort of line that's being used, set out to respond to the problem, identifying there is a problem without actually saying what the problem is. But yes, there's a problem, and therefore we need the Teach For groups. And then there's also, as part of their mantra, celebrating the impact in relation to the problem. And in Australia, when this was 2014, the very first incarnate of Teach for Australia, and you'll see the terminology again down here. The problem is urgent. And so no one, you know, with the innuendo of no one else is doing anything about it, we're addressing the problem. And of course, in England, with the academies, Michael Gove, a couple of years ago, identified that they could hire unqualified staff in the way that we'd probably think of qualifications. It's interesting in this context, though, that all of this is happening, but then the Carter Review, the most recent review in England, really reinforced the importance of university study in teacher education. So it's rather heartening, and partnerships. And similarly here, as I understand it, in Scotland, there are a number of authors that talk about the resistance to the English ideology, and certainly capitalising on the respect and influence of the General Teaching Council. And I know we've got some colleagues from there here. And this, Ian Mentors talked about this high degree of public and political trust in teacher education. And I think that's really, really interesting and important, because I actually don't see that in many other countries. So it's something to keep hold of and understand and work out how you're going to use that. And of course, the Donaldson report also highlighted teaching as a profession and the key role of universities in teacher education. So that's the first one, the bypassing that's going on in many countries. As I said, I've picked a few that I know well to talk about, but there are, there's Teach for China, it's everywhere. Then there's this notion of best practice, what works, focusing on that. The seductive, as Bob Berlow talks about, it's the seductive pursuit of what we call best practice, and he calls that's the single best solutions to complex problems. And I think that does sort of capture what's trying to happen. So, for example, I'm sure you know about the Education Endowment Foundation that comes up with these sorts of templates that looks at particular types of research that they determine is appropriate scientifically, and then rates them according to cost and the strength of the evidence and so on. Similarly, in Australia, we've got our Social Ventures Australia is doing a similar kind of thing. They've come up with a teaching and learning toolkit that's modelled very closely on the EEF toolkit approach. And of course, the What's Works clearinghouse in the US, which has been going for quite some time now, has again also done a similar sort of thing that identifies particular type of research, usually according to method that's used in the research or the sample size or something like that, and then identifies the outcomes of that. Okay, and of course this return to the craft view has had an impact on teacher education, privileging a whole range of things, practical, experiential knowledge over theoretical, pedagogical, and so on. Better move along a little. This increasingly complex apparatus of teacher certification and regulation. So in Australia, we've got a national body, AITSL, then we've got each of the states have got their own bodies, and then we've got standards which purport to explain what teachers should know and be able to do at different levels of their career. The interesting thing about these standards, and I think it's similar in some places, is the way in which they were developed. Very little research informed or evidence base to develop these standards. I'll tell you a story which will probably explain how this happened. So prior to the national standards being developed, each of the states had developed their own sorts of standards. And so when the national standards were being developed, I would go to a meeting in Sydney in New South Wales, and people there would say, oh, it's okay, we can handle these, they're just our standards anyhow. Then I go to a meeting in Victoria, in Melbourne, and the people there would say, it's okay, we can handle these new national standards, they've just copied ours anyhow, and so it goes on, So in effect what it was whoever was in the room at the time and agreed and came up with a set of standards. And of course, the notion of standards in and of itself, I don't think is such a bad thing. Being able to name what it is high quality teachers know and are able to do, but it's often the process that's used to develop them and the kind of minimum level, I suppose, of what you might expect for a teacher to know and be able to do. And I know colleagues here, Nanetta, for example, has critiqued standards in terms of the way in which they position culturally diverse learners and culturally responsive teaching. And I also noticed that, I'll come to that in a moment actually. In the US, similar organisations, TIAC in CAPE, it's become CAPE, and in England similarly. And then the General Teaching Council here have got standards. And I've been reading a little bit about this, and people have been talking about how the process by which these standards were developed was a very inclusive and collaborative process, and as a result the standards are different and include notions of social justice and research underpinnings and teacher curricular autonomy, which I think is an interesting comment. So it's about the process of getting people involved to develop them that seem to be quite important. Focus on entry, I've talked about that briefly earlier. So, there's this massive frenzy, these are from newspapers, ranking institutions in Australia according to ATAR. ATAR stands for the Australian Tertiary Admissions Rank. It's based on high school grades and so on, and with the assumption that that leads to a higher quality teaching profession. Teacher testing. We've just got that started up now as of this year. And of course, that's been also, I know, in England. With here in Scotland, looking at the report, Teaching Scotland's Future, I noticed that one of the recommendations does talk about more rigorous entry, ways of selection criteria and so on. And diagnostic assessments for literacy and numeracy, but I also notice that it's talking about highlighting issues of access into teacher education, part-time, distance, and so on. Okay, the fifth one, this focus on the impact of teacher education, and probably in the US, the value-added modelling. The notion of looking at standardised test scores of the students that someone's teaching at a particular point in time, then looking at it at another point in time to see if that teacher has an impact. I think the most challenging part of this whole value-added modelling or statistical standardised test scores approach rather, is the notion of teacher A came out of a teacher education program here, teacher B came out of this teacher education program. Teacher A's, the standardised test scores of the students that teacher A teaches are better than the one that this teacher teaches, therefore that teacher education program must be better. And that's actually being used a lot. We could do a whole talk about deconstructing that, but you get the idea. And the focus on outcomes of teacher education. The EdTPA, as I mentioned earlier, Pearson has taken over. Did start off with a bunch of universities in California, but now has been taken over across the country. And even in Australia, our most recent review highlights assessment of graduates and quality assurance. Okay, what's the role of research in all of this? Well, as Donna Wiseman says, ideally, these policies would all emerge out of research, but it's not really the way it happens. And Pam Grossman said a few years ago when she was president of AERA that we in teacher education don't seem well equipped to respond to all of these things that are happening. And Christine Sleater talks about that the research is fragmented, often narrowly focused. And that's not surprising. Teacher education research doesn't usually attract the big bucks. So we all research often our own programs because that's what's easier, most viable to do. Unfortunately, those smaller programs often don't talk to each other, so policymakers just ignore all of them. So what have I done? Let me just spend the last little bit of the time sharing with you quickly some of the research that I've done in this context, because I sit and look at all of this, and as a teacher education researcher, I think, well, what is it that we can do? So what I was able to do in Australia is get together a big team. We got funding from the Australian Research Council, and we followed graduates from their teacher education program into the first few years of teaching to try and determine how they felt about their teacher education program and their induction, to try and understand what was happening in the sense of trying to have something to say back to policymakers. The research questions here, they're a bit clumsy, and that's because they were developed with our partners over about 12 months. Our partners were two large departments of education in Victoria and Queensland, as well as the teacher regulatory authorities in those states. But in essence, there were three main things. We were trying to understand how well equipped these people felt they were for their teaching positions. We were trying to understand if there were particular characteristics of teacher education programs that seemed to be more effective. We weren't comparing programs, we're looking at characteristics. And then thirdly, we wanted to see if there was any impact on the employment pathways retention. This is the team, as I said, quite a large team with our partners. Actually, because of time, I might just jump over that if you don't mind. I might skip a few as we go through. Okay, target population here was about 15,000 teacher education graduates in Queensland and Victoria. We looked at, we analysed all of the schools there that we could use. We did a mapping of initial teacher education programs across Australia. We had surveys of graduate teachers and their principals, 4 rounds over 3 years. And we had almost 200 graduate teachers from 29 schools that we visited every year. And so we lived their beginning teaching. A bit of a diagram of how the surveys came together to develop the data sets, but mainly I wanted to show you this because it shows you some of the response rates down here for each of the rounds. And that's one of the challenges of this large-scale survey research is the response rates. I don't know what happens here, but in Australia, everyone wants to survey the first-year teachers or the second-year teachers. So the employers do it, the regulatory authority does it, academics are wanting to do it. Survey fatigue is huge. So the response rates varied, but sufficiently enough statistically to be able to draw something from it. Additionally, there was a cohort that we were able, the same people who answered rounds 2, 3 and 4, so we were able to look at that longitudinally. Now, as you can imagine, there's a mountain of data, so I just wanted to share with you a couple of the things that then lead to the conclusion that I want to make. So who were they first? Well, they were pretty representative of other databases on the teaching profession in the first few years in Australia. Most data says it's about 80% are female in the teaching profession in Australia. This is an unfortunate one, reported English as their only language, 94%. So it tells you a lot about who the cohort are. 1% identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander compared to 3% of the population. This one here, 43% identified as the first in their family. It's a thing that we hear a lot about the teaching profession, and nursing too, is often portrayed as the people who first in their family to get a tertiary qualification. Well, indeed, our data would support that. Most were full-time, most were domestic. Excuse me. Majority were primary and secondary. There were some early childhood, and their motivation for teaching was that they wanted to make a difference. Their pathways into teaching, about 55% were in graduate teacher education programs, and that included about 7 to 10% in master's programs. This, I should explain to you, these of course were people who graduated 2010, 2011. It's before the new requirements for a 2-year master's program for a graduate teacher education. We've had that now in Australia for a couple of years. So that's why this master's program is a bit lower than we might expect. Employment. Excuse me. So, not surprisingly, employment goes up, but not total employment after graduation. This one, though, I think is the more interesting one. This breaks it down into the type of employment. And if you look at the blue, that signifies the full-time permanent. About 27% start their teaching career in full-time permanent employment. And that only increases to about 50% over a couple of years. If you look at the brown, the full-time contract, that's about 50% starting off. Now, if you add the 10% part-time contract, so the brown and the green, if you look in round one, the brown and the green, that adds up to about 60% start their teaching career on contracts. And this became very, very, very significant in this study. It was very closely linked to the way in which they felt about the effectiveness of their teacher education program. It was very much mediated by the type of employment they had. Not surprisingly, perhaps males were more likely to be in full-time permanent positions, even though the majority were females. About 75% would recommend their program to others. It was pretty strong in each of the rounds. But if you look at the statement at the bottom, those with a teaching position definitely felt more positive about their teacher education program than those without, particularly if they had full-time permanent positions. Okay, now the survey had about 46 items, which were people were asked about their preparedness in relation to those items and their effectiveness as beginning teachers in relation to those items. So research is based on perceptions. I should have said that right at the beginning, and all of the limitations of that, totally acknowledge all of that. But that we deliberately decided to take that approach, perceptions as opposed to classroom observations and things like that. That'll come later. Overall, they do feel prepared, if you think of the 5-point Likert scale, and they do feel effective. They actually feel more effective than they feel prepared. And I'm just going to go through these quickly and leave them with you. The principals rated them more effective than they rated themselves, which in Australia I don't know about here, but for years we have got, principals think that the graduates that they're getting are not well prepared. Well, our data would suggest otherwise. The 46 items were broken down to 9 scales. So even though overall they felt prepared and overall they felt quite effective, of course there were things they felt more prepared and less prepared in. And that probably won't surprise you. Pretty much matches a lot of other research about the things that people feel they're prepared or not in. And similarly, effectiveness. Is that how many? 5? How am I going for time? Am I over 5? Okay, I'll skip a whole pile. Okay, couple of things. One of the things that did come out of this is that people with master's and bachelor's programs definitely felt more prepared than one-year diploma programs. So that actually reinforced the policy decision to move to a 2-year program. What we tried to do is try and look at how people responded to various things and then backtrack to their programs to see what their programs look like. They certainly thought that the skills in the practicum were important, but when we do the analysis, there was no link to different types of practicums, whether it was blocks, days per week, there was no clear view. Interns, people who did interns, programs right at the end after they'd done the required number of supervised days, did feel slightly better prepared. And there was some link between if you had a practicum in the school that was similar to the one that you began teaching in, that that seemed to impact positively on sense of preparedness and effectiveness. But, and I'll just draw your attention to the top one here. When we did all of the breakdowns, all the analysis of different components of teacher education, we found that the characteristics of teacher education, this type of practicum, this particular way of doing methods, this particular way of developing content knowledge, etc., 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 seem to account for little of the variance of the way in which people felt prepared and effective. I'll leave the other 2 bits there. I think I've talked about that. Oh, just one thing I wanted to draw to your attention here. This job security and mobility. People moved on because they were looking for more secure employment. Yes, there was evidence to show that if they had a good induction, focused on professional learning, etc., support in their school, they were more likely to stay. But one of the big things that impacted whether they would stay or whether they would go was the type of employment they had. Similarly, what we discovered in the case studies is the sorts of behaviours that some of these early career teachers engaged in as they undertook their job in the first year or so were often totally linked to trying to get more secure employment and very little to do with student learning. And I find that a bit disturbing. So that the activities, what they did with their colleagues, everything seemed to be geared towards trying to get more permanent employment. We had examples of people who went to far-flung places and we visited them there because they were offered permanent employment. and of course, crashed and burned because of a whole range of reasons, personal and professional. So this issue of the type of employment just mediated everything that we were finding. Okay, I'll perhaps share this as well, because we know there's a lot about what are people staying in the profession. And so this one was, over each round, do you see yourself working as a teacher in school in 3 years' time? Going down each time. About 66% in the first round, down to a little less, I think, than 50% by the fourth round. I've just picked up this one here. Correspondingly, increasing numbers are seeing themselves rather as going into leadership positions, but not in the same comparison, and working outside teaching altogether. This was working in policy context, this is working in an alternative education session, and this was other. Okay, let me wind it up then. So, I've only shared a few things of the data, and we've just published the 4-year report for this, so there's a lot of information in there. But what I wanted to share with you this evening was, I think, one of the big things that's coming out of this for myself and the team. That we're starting to use the word learning teaching a lot more, as opposed to learning to teach, because learning to teach signifies an endpoint, and we all know that that's not the case. So learning teaching, it's not linear, it's not stage-based. It's definitely mediated by the local context, as well as the broader political context and local conditions of work. One of the big chunk of our data talks about how these beginning teachers deal with schools and what's called NAPLAN in Australia is the first standardised tests across all schools for literacy and numeracy. However, one of the quite significant things that came out is its lack of connection between teacher education in universities and teacher education and teaching practice in schools. And it was popularised in the discourse all the time as this so-called theory-practice divide. And these play out as dichotomies in all of the data that we've got. So, and we hear this a lot in policy documents, I've come to realise, as I've gone searching a bit more. So this notion of you're prepared, then you're effective. The notion of pre-service and in-service. Universities, schools, learning, teaching, doing teaching. So all these separate things. And they're often talked about in accountability contexts. So finger-pointing goes on, So, well, teacher education is not working in universities, it should be in schools. So this sort of toing and froing that happens. And I'm going to skip that. But what we're arguing, coming out of this work, and still got quite a lot to do in terms of theorising this a little more, is this notion of a transitional teacher education, to try and address the dichotomies. Now, I know people have been talking about a continuum of learning for a long, long time, but I think what we're trying to do is to go beyond that, because continuums of learning often still talk about pre-service, induction, proficient teacher, whatever. So there's still this kind of continuum of sub-bits, if you like. But what we're thinking is there this new hybrid space where teacher education involves everyone? Now, I know, for example, here, You've had the Scottish Teachers for a New Era, which had, I understand, modelled off some of the US stuff as well, which brought learning teaching and doing teaching and induction all together. Not consecutively or in a linear way, but together. And there are examples of bringing all of that together, particularly in postgraduate programs, master's programs. There's, for example, when I was at Berkeley, one of our programs had a 2-year, and that was very intertwined. People started teaching, they came back for classes. Of course, that's always limited when it means they've got to be in schools close by, or I know the problems associated with that. I think these are some of the other things that I would be arguing for. Inquiry-centred, we're not looking for best practice, and that something about pedagogies for learning teaching that help pre-service teachers and beginning teachers make sense across these spaces to try and break down those dichotomies that I referred to. Okay, so back to David Stow. I think when we're thinking about this transitional teacher education, which, you know, I keep saying I don't know what it looks like, but that's probably a good thing because I don't want to end up with a model, but it's a set of principles or notions attached to it. And I think if we reflect on some of the things that David Stow stood for, you know, as I mentioned right at the beginning, education for all, the power of education to help people's life chances, emphasising the whole child, certainly the importance of the teacher, the critical importance of effective teacher education, that there's a specialised knowledge base and skills and so on. And I thought the interesting point about people in the middle class like himself who had benefited by all of these improvements had a duty to ensure the support for people who had suffered by that. I think we can bring all of this together and think about some of the points that I've made and go beyond, as I said right at the beginning, go beyond the policy borrowing or the policy travelling. I think we have to look outward in each country and work together to try and come up with something new. We in Australia, for example, could look to you in Scotland and say, well, you've held the wolf to the door, or those kinds of things. But I think it's about us working together to see how we can address some of these things. And they look slightly different in each context, and that's fine. But I think there's a power globally, because there is a juggernaut going on out there, of what's happening around the teaching profession and teacher education, that I think collectively we've got to take a stand, we've got to use our research, we've got to use our practice and our voice to ensure that we maintain teaching as a profession and, I would argue, teacher education as a profession. Thank you.